In November 1983, US and NATO troops suddenly went on high alert. A small fleet of cargo planes were moving thousands of American troops to Europe in complete radio silence. B-52s were being armed with bombs as the Strategic Air Command raised its nuclear threat alerts to the highest level they could go. As the chaos unfolded, the Soviets observed the whole thing. If the West was going to launch a surprise nuclear attack, the Soviets knew their best bet was to beat them to the punch by launching one of their own first. For a moment, it looked like the nuclear war everybody had been worrying about for decades was finally at our doorstep, and the American public was completely unaware of it for years to come. If you're only familiar with the Cliff Notes version of the Cold War, you might assume that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the only time the United States and the Soviet Union came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war. But turns out there's a lot we get wrong about America's decades-long standoff with the Soviets. Hi, I'm Justin Dodd, and today we're talking myths and misconceptions about the Cold War. East versus West, communism versus capitalism, Pepsi versus Coke. That last one is a little bit more literal than you might think. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often remembered as the cautionary tale of how close we could come to World War III in the blink of an eye. The long and short of it is that following the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba made a deal with the Soviet Union for nuclear weapons. The US learned of the deal and set up a quarantine around Cuba, which is sort of the non-combat version of a blockade, to stop shipments of weapons. There was a standoff, a few tense phone calls were exchanged, and we could have all been annihilated at the push of a button. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and President Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to discuss their issues rather than bomb us all back to the Stone Age. Though this event gets most of the historical press, you might not be aware that it wasn't the only time the Cold War almost boiled over because of a petty squabble or misunderstanding. Another close call was the Able Archer incident from November 1983. Able Archer was the name of a military training exercise carried out by NATO that was meant to simulate what would have to happen should a nuclear war break out. According to Slate, these war games involved the movement of 19,000 troops and an arsenal of aircraft. Fake bombs were loaded into real planes. Radio silence maintained the illusion throughout. Everyone simulated DEFCON 5 through DEFCON 1 exactly as they would if there had been real nukes going off across the globe. While the US and NATO continued to gear up for what looked like an attack, the Soviets followed suit, escalating their alert status as their foes did. One tiny problem: the nuclear weapons they were loading onto aircraft were live. Non-reconnaissance flights were grounded across the Warsaw Pact airspace, and according to The Nation, Soviet nuclear subs headed for cover near the Arctic. So, why is the Earth still spinning? Well, for starters, you can thank Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence for US Air Forces in Europe. He watched how the Soviets were responding and realized this was a bit more than grandstanding in the face of military exercise. The Soviets were actually ready to go on the offensive. Sensing that a real war could break out over some fake maneuvering, Perutz advised his superiors not to escalate the exercise any further, diffusing the situation before it turned into a world-ending affair. Along with his warnings, a KGB double agent working for the UK got the word out to their government, which then contacted Washington about the situation. Author Nate Jones, who wrote a book on the incident, said, "Had Perutz mirrored the Soviets and escalated the situation, the war scare could conceivably have become a war." If you're just learning about all this now, there's a good reason for that. While the public knew some of what was going on in Cuba as it happened, we didn't really know a whole lot about Able Archer until a report of its events was declassified in 2015. It was such a secret that the year before the details came to light, Perutz barely got 3 lines on his Wikipedia page without a single peep about the incident. After the whole thing was revealed, the wiki was generously bumped to 5 lines. Though having your biography end with, "He is credited with helping to avert a nuclear war," is as good a capper as any. If that isn't unsettling enough, this incident came just 2 months after a computer glitch in a Soviet satellite erroneously reported that the US had launched 5 ballistic missiles into Soviet territory. Again, lucky for us, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov had a quote, "funny feeling" in his gut that the computers were wrong and decided not to act on it. Cold War spies were all secretly placed behind enemy lines. Spies have been used for political and military gain for as long as people have been seeking political and military gain. Sun Tzu wrote on the benefits of espionage in The Art of War. Roman emperors employed spies, and George Washington's ring of spies proved invaluable during the Revolutionary War. But none of those moments in history quite conjure up the same vivid images as the Cold War era spy, thanks to the fictionalized accounts of their death-defying jobs from authors like John le Carre and Ian Fleming. Fleming, of course, created James Bond as the epitome of the debonair spy with sex appeal to spare, and for the last time, I'm not interested in taking over the role from Daniel Craig. I have my sights set higher. In the real world, where, frustratingly, no one has asked me to play James Bond, not all spies were pulling off covert and illegal operations unbeknownst to their adversaries. Some spies were actually welcomed on each side with open arms. This is all thanks to something called the Military Liaison Missions. This was an agreement between the Soviets and the West that allowed for a certain number of opposing intelligence officers to be let in on both sides in Germany to keep tabs on things and keep communication flowing. It was meant to actually relieve tensions among the superpowers, as there would be less paranoia and tension if you were allowed to peep on the other guy in plain sight. In effect, it basically turned into legal spying on both sides, according to Atlas Obscura. From this rather strange agreement came one of the most successful operations of the entire Cold War, and it just so happened to revolve around used toilet paper. It was called Operation Tamarisk, and it all started because Soviet troops working in the field in East Berlin weren't issued actual toilet paper when going about their business. Instead, they had to improvise by using any sort of paperwork they found to wipe their supple commie behinds. Sometimes these would be blank sheets, other times they would use letters and other harmless bits of stationery, but sometimes they were forced to use top secret documents to do the dirty work. And since you can't flush paper like this without wreaking havoc on your plumbing, these sheets were put into the garbage after use and moved to a dumpster. When the US, UK, and France learned of this, they had their perfectly legal officers infiltrate these spots to fish through the Soviet garbage and pull out the stained documents. They'd be given a good cleaning and pieced back together, the documents, not the spies, or honestly both, hopefully. The point is, there was a time in history of military intelligence where if you drew the short straw, it could mean dumpster diving for poopy papers that could contain information on Soviet supply drop-offs, tank schematics, delivery schedules, and other highly sensitive information. Historian Richard J. Aldrich called the smeared intel gold dust to the growing army of analysts in London and Washington. On the subject of number 2, the West was kind of obsessed with it during the Cold War. In 1959, while Nikita Khrushchev was on a visit to the US, some poor soul at the CIA was tasked with salvaging some of the Soviet premier's leavings after he used the bathroom. It was studied, analyzed, and admired, only to find that, and we're quoting the Washington Post here, Khrushchev was an excellent health for a man of his age and rotundity. How's that for US hospitality? Most Americans supported the space race. The space race is often portrayed as one of the most agreeable causes of the 20th century. When President John F. Kennedy promised that the US would land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, it was a rallying cry for the nation and something that would inspire a new generation to quite literally reach for the stars. Plus, it would really stick it to the Soviets. The US finally made one giant leap for mankind in July 1969, but it wasn't cheap. All told, the final cost of the Apollo program that got us to the moon was $25 billion in 1969's money. That's more like $152 billion today. And as it turns out, the effort and expense to land on the moon didn't enjoy particularly widespread approval in the States. In 1965, only 39% of people thought the US should get to the moon first, regardless of expense. Did that change once people finally witnessed man slip the surly bonds of Earth and play golf among the stars? No. In 1979, 53% of people said the space program wasn't worth what we were spending. By 1994, the number of yays and nays was finally even at 47%. It wouldn't be until 1999 that the majority of people finally believed the cost was justified, and even then, it was only 55% that agreed. The Cold War was always tense. When we think of the Cold War, it's easy to view it as a never-ending tension from the 1940s to the late 80s that encompassed pretty much the entire planet. And yes, the 50s and 60s had their fair share of scary moments, and yes, we were almost all killed because of a misunderstanding in 1983, but there was a period in the 70s when everything calmed down to a mild simmer. And for that, among other things, you can thank President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, two men who worked hard for peace and not so hard at maintaining their eyebrows. Got 'em! This time of relative serenity really kicked off in May 1972, when Nixon became the first US president to visit Moscow. During this time, the two men talked about how lowering tensions could benefit both nations, and they signed a number of agreements on arms control while promising future cooperation for areas like space research. That was actually a promise they fulfilled. Within 3 years of this meeting, the two powers collaborated on the Apollo-Soyuz test project. It saw their respective space programs come together to develop a compatible rendezvous and docking system that could be used by the US and Soviet ships in case of an emergency. Space scientist Roel Sagdiv and his then-wife Susan Eisenhower, Ike's granddaughter, later wrote an essay explaining that the impetus behind this rare group project was a movie called Marooned, starring Gene Hackman and Gregory Peck, which focuses on a group of American astronauts who get stranded in space and have to be rescued by their Soviet counterparts. For historians, this period of relative calm is known as détente, and for all its good intentions, it began to fray after Nixon resigned in 1974. The easing of tensions is often said to have ended with the fallout from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan took a hard line and explicitly said that détente has been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its aims. Still, it's important not to think of the Cold War as one continuous geopolitical crisis that went on for decades without end. It ebbed and flowed with periods of heightened tension and times when most average citizens probably didn't give it a second thought. The Soviet Union was completely cut off from Western influences. If the propaganda of the time and the comedic oeuvre of Yakov Smirnoff is to be believed, you'd imagine the Soviet Union as something of a hermit kingdom, completely cut off from the creature comforts of the West in the 70s and 80s. Turns out, it's not exactly the case. In addition to their own film industry, the Soviet government would often purchase a handful of American movies at a time for theatrical distribution. The choices might not be what you'd expect. Soviets had a weird soft spot for lavish comedies like Tootsie and Some Like It Hot. Although in the USSR, the latter film was shown under a title that could be translated into something like Girls Only in Jazz. Not as catchy. If you were a kid who wanted to see Star Wars, you just have to hope that your local black market VHS van had an illegal copy to sell you for a few rubles. One familiar American brand that came to the Soviets in a big way was Pepsi. This was the first US consumer good to exist in the Soviet Union, and it came into the scene in 1974. But since the company couldn't receive payment for their product with the ruble being restricted, the Soviets simply traded their own Stolichnaya vodka to Pepsi to distribute in the US, while the soft drink giant provided the syrup concentrate to the Soviets to make the soda on their own. It's estimated that the Soviet Union consumed more than 1 billion servings of Pepsi every year by the late 80s. And although you could get Fanta earlier, Coca-Cola was largely locked out by the Soviets until 1985. As the Soviet Union really began falling apart in the early 90s, the floodgates opened and you could soon find McDonald's and Pizza Huts springing up around Moscow, providing perhaps the clearest sign that the times were a-changin'. And on the subject of Pizza Hut, in 1997, none other than Mikhail Gorbachev himself, former Soviet leader, starred in a commercial for the fast food chain. Which, by the way, if the James Bond gig doesn't take off, I'd be happy to portray Ronald McDonald. Just call me. The collapse of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War. On Christmas night 1991, the familiar red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered at the Kremlin in Moscow for the final time, and in its place rose the red, white, and blue tricolor flag of the newly independent Russian state. The moment was a romantic historian's dream, a symbol of the fall of the Soviet Union at the end of a decades-long Cold War with the West. Realistically, the Cold War was pretty much over before the Soviet Union officially dissolved. By the end of the 80s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had been slowly communicating more openly with the West on issues like arms control and human rights. In May 1988, when a reporter asked if President Reagan still thought of the Soviet Union as the quote-unquote evil empire like in his infamous 1983 speech, he responded, "I was talking about another time, another era." That type of cheeriness from the Gipper would have been unthinkable even a few months earlier. By the next year, the Berlin Wall came down. When President George H.W. Bush met with Gorbachev at the Malta Summit in December '89, there was a lot of talk about working together and cooperating for a better tomorrow. It certainly didn't sound like wartime bravado anymore, but you'll still routinely see historians and media outlets saying the Cold War dragged on until 1991. So what gives? Well, one possibility is that it's all about storytelling. In a 2010 lecture at the Carnegie Council, former ambassador to the Soviet Union Jack Matlock recalled a time when a producer invited him to watch the closing moments of a Cold War documentary that was in the works. It proudly stated that the fall of the Soviet Union on that December night in 1991 was the end of the war. When Matlock told the producer that he had gotten it wrong and that the war actually ended in 1989, the producer just looked at him and said, "Yes, but that's not dramatic." Never let the truth get in the way of a good story, as it were. And while I think it's fair to say that the Cold War was over in a meaningful way before the official dissolution of the Soviet Union, it wasn't necessarily smooth geopolitical sailing from 1989 onwards. In January 91, months after Lithuania declared independence, the Soviets cracked down on the Baltic states, killing over a dozen people and sparking a Western backlash that Gorbachev said was reminiscent of the worst moments of the Cold War. Since there was no declaration of war to officially kick off the Cold War and no treaty at the end to give us a satisfying finale, kinda makes sense that so many textbooks and documentaries latch onto the symbolism of that Christmas night in 1991 as the final day of the conflict. But really, by this point, America was already thinking about its next war. Thanks for watching Misconceptions. We'd like to know, what frustrating misconception do you want tackled? Until then, stay vigilant, comrades.